Lake Superior, the Great Water. Born in the cradle of the oldest rock in the world, over 2 billion years old. Embedded along her shores are the scars of time. Through the ages, we have struggled to gain a foothold on this wild, majestic place.
The largest expanse of fresh water in the world, Superior, is an inland sea. It contains so much water that to replenish itself takes 191 years. On a journey to seek out the human stories left on the lake's mythic northern and eastern shores.
Up this mystic shore, the Ojibwe's giant hero, Nana Bushu, stopped to rest at this mighty stone, the Devil's Chair, after striding across the lake. Ojibwe dared not pass here without leaving an offering of tobacco to help ensure safe passage. From this throne, Nana Bushu oversaw his watery domain, a lake of unfathomable mystery. Devil's Warehouse Island, so named by missionaries, repelled by the undeniable power they felt here. Eyes peer out from caves, studying one's every move. It was here the Ojibwe chose to bury their most important records, sacred teachings written on birch bark scrolls. These scrolls may be lost, but Superior Shores hold other records of human existence in this spirit world. On an imposing rock face are pictographs so old, their survival at such an exposed location defies explanation. Paint blended with magic, a secret passed down by the gods. Most striking is the powerful underwater Manitou, Mishibishu. He lurks in both deep and white water. Easily enraged, one angry sweep of his spiny tail churns the lake and sends men to their death. The Ojibwe have lived on the shores of Superior for centuries, living by the rhythms of the lake and under the shadow of the gods. They made peace with this unforgiving land. They hunted during the winter. In spring, they made maple syrup. During the summer, they congregated around the rapids of Bawating, now Sault Ste. Marie, for meetings and festivities, and for the annual run of whitefish. Protected by the thunderbirds, cautious of Mishibishu and of horrifying giant monsters, specters of starvation, the Wendigos. The Ojibwe respected and honored the Manitous around them and played by their rules. There were places to avoid, like the mystical floating isle of Michipicoten, sometimes far off and sometimes near, depending on the whim of the winds that push and drive it in all directions. The world was understood. Then, the giant Nanabuju had a vision.
He saw gleaming sails and many people. He knew the Ojibwe must move to the end of the lake or be destroyed. Some followed him. Others scoffed, refusing to believe the paradise at Bawating could be anything but.
In 1671, at Sault Ste. Marie, the French held a ceremony to claim all the territories west of Montreal in the name of Louis XIV, one territory of French and Indians. The French king was described to the assembled Indian nations.
When he attacks, he is more terrible than the thunder. He has slain so many with his sword that he does not count their scalps, but the rivers of blood which he sets flowing.
Europeans were less interested in the land than in one furry animal, the beaver. The rodent took hold of the European imagination, its sophisticated engineering mind, its refined sociability. But mostly, it took hold of their fashion scene. Beaver felt hats were all the rage. French traders established small trading posts along Superior shores. With the appearance of the Hudson's Bay Company, the fur trade became more sophisticated. This one company was granted all the land which drained into Hudson Bay. Not willing to lose their share of the trade, the Montreal-based fur traders formed the rival Northwest Company. As seen on their coat of arms, in this battle, perseverance was the name of the game. The Northwest Company followed the traditional inland canoe route from Montreal to the interior. Voyageurs canoed west to supply the fur traders with trading goods and returned east with the valuable pelts. They were a breed of workhorses, 12 to a canoe loaded with over 2 tons of freight. They could paddle 1,500 miles in 7 to 8 weeks, 45 strokes a minute, from before dawn till dusk. Lake Superior was daunting. Mashipashu was fond of tipping over canoes, and most voyageurs did not swim. Even if they did, Superior's waters are so cold, they would survive only a few minutes. The voyageurs met Indian trappers and fur traders from the Northwest for an annual July rendezvous here at Fort William. The rendezvous was a time of revelry, intense business dealings, and strategizing. Competition between the two fur companies was cutthroat. First, a Northwest Company post would pop up, then a Hudson's Bay post right alongside. Ruthless, mercenary tactics crippled both companies until they merged in 1821 under the banner of the Hudson's Bay Company. It was too late. Settlers were encroaching on hunting land, and the number of furs had declined due to overtrapping. European hat styles changed on a whim, leaving many Indians devastated in fashion's wake.
The foundation of early Canada was built on fur trading posts, like this one at Michipicoten. Like so many, it fell into disuse, and now barely a trace remains.
After fur, the next big pull came from the treasures of the earth. In the early 1840s, Lake Superior shocked the industrialized world when a giant pure copper boulder was found on the lake's southern shore. A staking rush was on. By the late 1840s, prospectors were clamoring all over Indian lands, and mine sites were springing up. Ojibwe chiefs like Shingwok despaired.
You have swept away all our pleasant land, and like some giant foe, you tell us, willing or unwilling, he now must go from amid these rocks and wastes. You say, I want them now. I want them to make rich my white children, while you may shrink away to holes and caves like starving dogs to die.
Tensions came to a head in 1849. In utter frustration, Chiefs Shingwok and Kinabenegajing led a raid on a mining site on these shores at Point O'Min. Awakened from their sleep, the miners fled into the night. The raid forced the government to take notice and finally provoked the initiation of land treaties. In 1850, William B. Robinson signed the Robinson-Superior Treaty with some of the Lake Superior chiefs. Annual payments and small reserves were given in compensation for relinquishing title to vast tracts of land.
I explained to the chiefs that the lands now ceded were notoriously barren and sterile.
only thing the newcomers found sacred about this land was its profitability. A new era was ushered in by the unyielding 19th century capitalist. Men driven by visions of the power and wealth to be made by stuffing the insatiable appetite of the industrializing world. New larger American locks had been built at Sault Ste. Marie. The Indians were now neatly packed away on reserves. The country was ready for the taking. Or so they thought. Standing out among this new breed of industrialist was William Bell Frew. With military precision, he went to war with Lake Superior in his drive to create one of the most productive silver mines on the continent. The battleground was the tiny island of Silver Islet. Ore shafts were sunk underwater just off the small island. To protect them, Frew had miners work 18 hours a day to build a giant breakwater around the island and a dam around the shafts. Time was of the essence. The work had to be done before the first autumn storm.
We did it. Silver Islet has grown into an impressive complex, including a shaft house, blacksmith shop, rock house, an engine room, saloon, library, and bunkhouses. One for the Norwegians, one for the Cornishmen, and one for the others.
Over time, a lively village grew up along the mainland shore. And in the 1870s and 80s, a steamer cruise along the wild North Shore became a fashionable holiday for wealthy Americans, with Silver Islet a highlight of the tour. Passengers thrilled at seeing the famous silver mine on an islet a mere 90 feet long. The miners had a different perspective.
Those gawkers should try trading place with us to know what they're really looking at. What it's like to lower yourself over 1,000 feet under the monster lake, to be cold and wet, to fear flooding, or worse, the explosions set off when the flames from our head candles strike pockets of gas. A few shots of whiskey and a reading room make things bearable, he's sorely mistaken.
Our last assortment of Cornishmen turned out as troublesome as our Norwegians. After one day on the job, they either left or went on strike. As to the reasons offered, they were as many as quills on a porcupine. Poor board and foul air in the mine were the ones most mentioned.
Yet Frew's labor troubles were child's play compared with his main battle.
This lake is trying to destroy me. Time after time I have enlarged the breakwater. Each time I think it cannot crush this. It cannot, but each time it does. It seems as though the water will surely succeed in driving its invaders from the ground.
Lake Superior's assault reached legendary proportions. One storm tossed 5,000 tons of rock about like hailstones, destroying the blacksmith shop, tearing out 350 feet of timber cribbing. As Frew's war was being waged above water, below, the miners continued to toil. The shaft was now 1,200 feet deep. Coal-fired pumps had to be kept running continually to keep the water at bay. Then Superior delivered its final blow. In 1884, the coal supply boat was trapped in ice before reaching Silver Islet. Without fuel, The pumps fell silent, replaced by the sound of water flooding into the shafts. The war was over, and the most productive silver mine in the country was abandoned.
It is astounding that this insignificant seeming island once held the world's envious gaze. Just a sliver of rock, it is easy to see why it had to be expanded tenfold in order to withstand Superior's rage. Little is left to remind us of the miners' struggles. The abandoned mine shafts, once over 1,200 feet deep, stare up with hollow eyes. Frozen in Superior's waters are the defiant remnants of Fru's mighty walls.
Abandoned mine shafts pierce the shores, remnants of a lust for silver, gold, uranium, and copper. Pits were sunk, shanty towns built, hopes were raised, and most were shattered. Some dreams still cling to the shores. Most have been washed away. The next lure came from the seemingly endless forest. Logging north of Superior began quite late because of the region's remoteness and its boreal forest. Rather than the towering white pine ideal for construction, these trees were the scrubby black spruce, tamarack, and balsam fir. But once the appetite for papers set in the late 19th century, pulpwood loggers began sawing their way up Superior's east and north shores. Timbering the remote Puckasaw region began in earnest in 1917, when logging camps were established along the Puckasaw River. This was the heart of Superior, and penetrating it was no easy feat. On this clearing once stood the Puckasaw Depot. Cabins, bunkhouses, stables, and warehouses for the logging operation upriver stretched back from this white sand beach.
Like the forgotten mine on Silver Islet, it would be easy to pass by this peaceful stretch of shoreline without guessing that it once was home to a vibrant community. But we have heard that remnants of the depot can still be found.
At the depot, the season began in September, when 300 loggers would land at this wharf. Supplies for the winter, including 14,000 pounds of flour and many tons of hay, would be hauled up the hill to the depot, and then taken by horse team to the camps up the Pakasaw River.
Most of the boys in our camp were from Quebec, but there were some Scandinavians, Poles, and Indians. We were up before the crack of dawn and into the cookhouse. It was get in there, eat, and get out. No talking allowed out of respect for the cook. They just wouldn't stand for it. Cutting began in the fall and ended in January. We worked in teams using 6-foot crossbow saws. By the end of the day, you had only enough energy to crawl into bed.
Winter was the real test. The odd man couldn't stand it any longer and took off up the 70-mile White River Trail. But there weren't too many. Once in a while, the Scandinavians used to make their own skis and take off. But most of us were stuck there till spring.
Mail and supplies were brought in by winter dog team, 2 round trips a month. One trip would take 7 days when conditions were good.
Christmas we made costumes, made presents for the young ones. Someone would run some moonshine off, usually from raisins or plums. One fellow I remember made a batch out of split peas. It was awful stuff.
The best part was the sleigh haul to the riverbanks. That meant spring was around the corner, and after the river drive, you could go home.
In the spring, men displayed their prowess by driving the surging booty down the gush of Superior's swollen rivers. Old photographs let us glimpse into a former way of life.
Up at LaFleur's camp, the 2 LaFleur children died in a cabin fire. It was a hard blow. The blacksmith stayed up all night to make a cross, 2 hearts for each child.
The Fletcher cabin is the last holdout at the depot. The Pakasaw operation closed down in 1930 because of the Depression and because the wood was harder and harder to reach. river mouths, the logs were caught in giant floating booms. It was the era known as the Big Tow, when a fleet of tugs strained at 1 mile an hour, each rafting up to 12,000 cords of timber down to the ravenous mills at the Sioux. Most made it. Some met such big waves and bad weather. Superior clearly had alternate plans. The Big Tow developed late in the 1890s and lasted until the 1960s. With the coming of roads and logging trucks, it disappeared. Superior can be counted on for some things. Thick fog in the spring, stretches of summer calm, and autumn storms. This lake is so vast it is capable of creating its own weather systems, and does so mercilessly with alarming speed. None knew this better than the fishermen who sailed its waters, trying to negotiate their existence with this temperamental lake. For shelter, they built small camps in safe havens around the shores.
Over 70 kilometers from the nearest port was the most remote fishing station on Lake Superior, Quebec Harbor on Michipicoten Island.
The commercial fishery goes back to the 1840s and the Hudson's Bay Company. The company got into commercial fishing in order to stop the drain of its native trappers to the American Fur Company, who were employing the Indians as fishermen during the summer.
Come to see what's left of the operation that James and Ivan Purvis ran in the 1930s and 40s. Quebec Harbor was home to 70 people at its peak.
The company's tugs operated 7 days a week. Just under 200 miles of nets were set at a time to catch whitefish and lake trout, the big fish of the open water.
The guys in the packing house would grade them by fats and leans and pack them in ice. They knew their fish. One time we towed in a broken down American fishing boat. Packing guys could tell they'd been illegally fishing Canadian waters just by looking at the fish they had on board.
There were a couple of hundred net drying reels. Cotton nets were put up to dry so as they wouldn't rot. Each man had to do 2 boxes of nets a day when the boat came in.
Many of the buildings still stand at Quebec Harbor, each with its own piece of the story.
A favorite hangout was the cookery and store. Men used to stand at the counter and roll dice to see who was paying for the round of coffees. The blacksmith shop was brought piece by piece from an old mine on the west end of the island. Harbor was a family place. Most came only for the fishing season, but a few stayed over the long winter. Bunkhouses each housed 2 to 3 fishermen. In the evenings, some men fished the waters close to shore for extra cash, while others preferred to play poker or billiards.
Saturday night you could get a hell of a barn dance going above the packing house. A lot of the native guys from Manitoulin and Batchewana were pretty musical fellas. Fiddles, guitars, that sort of thing. We had some good times.
Many fishing camps and stations around Superior, like here at Bowman Island, died out by the 1950s. Families at the Gargantua fishing station had a reprieve from the isolation when the occasional private yacht pulled into the harbor. At Port Coldwell, paths that once led somewhere now lead nowhere. Overfishing was one cause. The other was the scourge of the Great Lakes, the dreaded sea lamprey, which sucked the life out of the fish and out of the fishing industry. These communities, mines, logging, and fishing camps, the focus was out towards the Great Lake. It was their lifeblood. Before trains or highways, the lake was the artery of the country. Freighters, and before them, schooners and steamers would come upbound through the Sioux locks. At the far end of the lake, they would load prairie grains at the Port Arthur and Fort William elevators, now Thunder Bay, and iron ore from ranges farther west. The shipping season began in the spring when tugs cut paths through the harbor ice.
Randy Smith, captain of the Upper Lakes shipping freighter, the Canadian Leader.
This boat carries grain downbound on the system, so we'll come up to Thunder Bay or Duluth or wherever we're going on Lake Superior, and we'll load a cargo of grain, take it down to the East Coast, unload it, and we'll reload iron ore down there and bring it up to one of the steel mills up here. In the springtime, there's usually a lot of ice up here, like Whitefish Bay, this part of the water here, like just jam-packed with ice. And if you know what I mean by windrow,
No.
by any chance, okay, what ice starts to break up and the wind's blowing it around and shifting, it'll pile up, and you'll get windrows 50, 60 feet thick of broken ice piled up that's floating in the water. That these,
Right?
yeah.
It's like seeing iceberg.
Ships' captains and crews were keenly aware of the lake's destructive potential. All they could do was take heed, show respect, and stay alert to the signs of changing conditions. For sailors, lighthouses were not just beacons of comfort, they were a lifeline. In 1867, the new Canadian government responded to the growing cry for safety by building Lake Superior's first lighthouse here on Talbot Island. It was referred to as the Lighthouse of Doom, a place so fraught with misfortune, the government abandoned it after only 6 years. 2 keepers died while trying to reach the mainland at the end of the season, and the third met an equally terrible fate.
Dear sir, I must inform you of the unfortunate death of lightkeeper Thomas Lamphere. For safety, he and his wife chose to winter on Talbot Island. When Mr. Lamphere died suddenly, his wife was left to survive the hard season alone on the isolated isle. When we arrived in the spring of 1869, we discovered her in a state of distraction. Her black hair turned stone white.
The light took more lives than it saved and was discontinued before the next season could exact its dreadful toll. After Talbot came a series of superior lights, like Isle Parisienne, marking the busy shipping channel into the St. Mary's River. Cap, built like a ship's prow to cut through advancing ice. Perched high on a cliff, the Slate Island's light throws its beam far across open water. As sentinels witnessing the extremes of Superior's fury, they have become legends unto themselves. Such is Battle Island Lighthouse, famed for the thunderous wave that hit this cliff with such force, its exploding spray burst the lantern room glass. And then there is Caribou Island, the most isolated lighthouse on the Great Lakes, over 100 kilometers from the nearest port. Early keepers were given sailboats to get themselves on and off the lights. Caribou's keeper, George Johnson, feared for his life. Crossing Superior in winter in an open sailboat was a death sentence. He motorized the boat, and in December, he and his assistants set off. Christmas passed without their return. They were slammed and tossed by ice for days. Johnson, convinced the boat wouldn't be able to take another blow. After 8 days on the open lake, the men finally showed up on New Year's Day. Caribou's next keeper, Mr. Pennifold, refused the suicide mission and began a writing campaign until the government agreed to deliver and pick up Lake Superior keepers. They sent out the Lambton, a boat that George Johnson, now a lighthouse inspector, warned officials against.
The Lambton is utterly unfit for Lake Superior. The steering quadrant freezes from the spray. Lifeboats are positioned on the uppermost deck. In the event of a disaster, no one could reach them. It's a death trap. To use this boat in winter conditions is unconscionable.
The government ignored Johnson's plea. With light keepers on board, the Lambton sailed the following spring of 1922 right into the heart of a storm. With news that 5 of the lighthouses were not lit, officials became worried. When debris from the Lambton was identified, hope was lost. All 22 on board perished, including Mr. Pennifold, the keeper of Caribou Light. There are ominous phenomena on Superior from which experience affords little protection. One of the strangest incidents happened when the Lee Field was pummeled for half an hour by giant waves in a freak storm. Not remarkable, but for the fact that within eyeshot, seas were calm, the sky was clear, and there was no wind. In 1933, there was another bizarre episode in Rossport when out of the blue, the water lifted, ripping out docks and depositing boats on shore. In cold weather, captains fear ice devils, freezing waves that coat a ship in more and more ice until it sinks or rolls over from the slogging weight. not to mention floe ice or slush ice that moves in and surrounds its victims. Superior's biggest threat remains her storms. Monster 30-foot waves advance like soldiers, sending chills through the most seasoned sailors. Most dreaded are killer waves, known as the Three Sisters. 1, 2, 3. They leap on deck, and thousands of tons of water push the ship's bow down into the gloomy depths. Trophies of her supreme power, shattered, broken, pounded. Even ocean-going vessels have been brought down by this lake. Like the Edmund Fitzgerald, a ship the length of 2 city blocks, snapped in two, and now lying in over 500 feet of water. But the Fitzgerald is not alone. Scattered across her rocky floor is Superior's triumphant cache. Twisted steel, crushed hulls, physical remains of days and nights of terror. After Confederation in 1867, the fledgling Dominion of Canada urgently needed to assert itself in the West. But in addition to the lake being icebound for 4 months of the year, there was another impediment to travel by way of Superior. It was brought to glaring light in 1870 when Americans blocked the Chicora from proceeding through the Sioux Locks. The ship was carrying troops sent to suppress Louis Riel's Northwest Rebellion. Finally allowed through, at the far end of the lake, the soldiers faced the murderous set of portages en route to the Lake of the Woods. Everyone knew there must be a better way. And beginning in the 1870s grew our national dream, a railway from sea to sea. The dream's biggest promoter was American railway tycoon William Cornelius Van Horn. Under his leadership, track was laid coast to coast in record time. One of his biggest nightmares was the section along Superior's North Shore, the section he described as 200 miles of engineering impossibilities. Rail and food supplies were brought in by CPR ships and delivered to rough-and-tumble shanty towns notorious for whiskey, weapons, and brawls. These diversions took some of the sting out of the brutal job. With the aid of only horses, hand picks and shovels, and nitroglycerin, these men crushed the rocks, cut the trees, built bridges, and laid the ties and rails. This difficult Superior stretch was exhausting the government's coffers. One particular mile of track cost an astounding $700,000. 12,000 men had to be fed, paid, and housed, 1,500 horses kept, and $750,000 spent on explosives alone. Politicians felt the fledgling country could not afford the exorbitant expense and recommended the use of American rail lines. The dream was in peril. Yet the man who said, "I eat all I can, I drink all I can, and I don't give a damn for anyone," can hardly be expected to be swayed from achieving his goal. When the project seemed doomed, Van Horn proposed a cunning plan. The Canadian government needed to dispatch troops to the west quickly to quash the Second Riel Rebellion. With the shipping lanes closed for winter, he promised to deliver the troops on time, knowing that if he succeeded, funds would be allocated to complete the railway. Having little choice, the government consented. From here, the push to complete the rail line reached bizarre proportions, including laying track on top of snow several feet deep. In early April, while the troops enjoyed farewell send-offs from Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, and Halifax, little did they know, 4 sections of track north of Superior, 86 miles in total, had still not been laid. Even as they approached, they had no idea what was waiting for them just around the corner. Where there was track laid, the soldiers huddled together in open gravel cars against temperatures that plummeted to 35 below. Crossing the rugged sections without tracks, men toppled out of sleighs. Mile upon mile, day after day, they waded through knee-deep slush. In brutal storms, drenched, exhausted, they fell in their tracks. But for the final stretch, the weather had yet another trick up its sleeve. Glare ice. For 8 hours, the troops stumbled across the open lake. When they finally reached the rail line at Red Rock, many were frostbitten and blinded. Some were nearly dead. Nothing in their lives had prepared them for the trek they had just survived, but this ordeal did prepare them for the rebellion. Van Horn had triumphed. By the time the troops returned, the engineering feat had been completed. On May 16, 1885, the last spike along the Montreal to Winnipeg section was driven near the Jackfish Tunnel. The railway brought life to the small fishing village of Jackfish. Iced fish was carted by wheelbarrow up to the tracks, where it was whisked off to Montreal and other distant markets. Jackfish next became a coaling depot for the CPR steam trains. Coal boats from Pittsburgh would unload their messy cargo at this 600-foot trestle dock. All the trains would stop at Jackfish to coal up, to fill their water tanks, and for the conductor to pass on the latest news. Jackfish was the center along this stretch of the North Shore. The town thrived until the 1950s, and now it is gone.
We came to Jackfish with Lyle Nickel, a former resident with a passion for the ghost town.
These are the remains of the old church, the old Catholic church, the Star of the Sea.
The Star of the Sea?
Yeah.
Look at this.
That road we just walked up had this plank boardwalk at one point.
Oh, right. Oh, neat.
Yeah, so instead of the road we would have walked up this.
more frequented spot in town was the Lakeview Hotel, and not just for locals. It was a magnet for the restless men in the nearby logging camps. They knew the train stopped at Jackfish, so they would spear a ride in.
When things got a little out of hand at the hotel, the owner would bang on the staircase, and Johnny Leah, big Finnish guy, would come storming down to break up the commotion.
Yeah, now here is the foundation of the old hotel. This was a popular watering hole for some of the people along the North Shore. There's some, well, rocks from Lake Superior.
They put this veneer on it
To cover up the lake rock.
It makes it look like vinegar when you've got this beautiful Lake Superior rock underneath. How did the hotel burn?
I don't know how it burned. It caught fire one night, but apparently it burned down in just next to no time whatsoever. It was so old and so dry that it just, once it caught, it went. And it was so fast that I often tell people I think the nails were even made of wood.
"300 men worked the coal docks. Conditions were precarious. Men walked on sagging planks 25 feet above ground. Before cranes, men shoveled the coal into buckets, which were raised and lowered by winches. It took 3 days to unload a freighter, and this with men working from 6 in the morning to 11 at night. After the long shift, the fun began. 3 times a week, the officers of the freighters would host dances on board. The revelry would continue till 4 in the morning. Violins, accordions, and pianos urging them on.
I can remember about 6 houses right in this area over here, of which you can see some right there. Probably this would have been a coal storage area, because you can see some of the remains. Here's a piece of anthracite number 9.
All the coal in town, did people get free coal with Jackfish having so much brought in?
No, as you're talking about that, I'm not sure if it was meant to be free. But I think there were a lot of pieces of coal along the tracks, so you'd go and pick coal like you'd pick blueberries, bring it home, scuttle buckets of coal.
Oh, yeah, the door?
I can't remember. But I remember when people lived in this place. I believe. I don't think, unless this is the new style. This little grasshopper.
Be up there working away.
The day the first diesel train zoomed right on past, without needing to stop for coal and water, we all went up to the tracks to watch. As the train rushed by, Jackfish lost its reason for being.
The end of the steam train meant the end of Jackfish. The coal docks closed down, And by 1963, everyone was gone. So many communities, so many fading marks. Water, and eons of time. The powerful presence of Lake Superior is undeniable to any who have gazed out from its shores or felt the lake heave under them. Oblivious to our weak efforts, the lake continues its slow, pulsing rhythms. Gods, like the sleeping giant Nana Boozhoo, wait.